So let's take a look at good information security risk management. Now, number one, risk management should be supportive from all members of the organization, but especially from the top down. That is the C-level people, the CIO, CEO, CISO, right? Everybody in that C, sometimes they call it a C-suite of staff, board of directors, executive management, all the way down. Having good security practices would need management commitment. And, let's think about that one statement. I can have a practice that says you cannot go to social networking sites while you're at work. And I may have people that do it. And so I say, okay, look, it says you can't go here. And somebody might say, yeah, well, you can't do anything because nobody ever enforces this rule. There, I would need to say, look, I need management commitment. I need to be able to make sure people understand that, if you are violating these rules that are prepared and designed for us to meet certain security objectives, that there's actually support in the enforcement as well. So that's a part of the management commitment. Now, that's one part of it, right? To have good security practices, I need the commitment. And risk management is required to really be able to have good security. So again, without risk management, we have no idea what we're trying to protect ourselves from. I mean, we may have some good guesses. We might kind of in an ad hoc process just buy some stuff that sounded really good to keep our system safe. Some latest and greatest antivirus software. Maybe took a server we're not using anymore, loaded Linux on it, and decided to run IP tables and make a firewall out of it. And I'm not saying that's not a bad solution. The idea is there's no thought process into it. So we need to have good risk management. We need to understand what we're protecting, why we're protecting it, what the threats are. That makes the security practices, and of course the management commitment. All right. So to get that risk management part, that's kind of our focus on this domain. That means we need a couple of things to develop this program. Number one, what is the purpose of the program? What is the scope and charter? Now, scope and charter, and I hope I've already kind of answered the purpose of the program. Scope and charter is what areas do I care about? We do have to sometimes worry that each individual business unit may silo themselves off into their own little sections and do their own risk assessments and their own business impact assessment, and that's a good thing. It should be done. But we have to realize that some of one part of a business unit may interact with another business unit. I might be able to be bold enough to say that most every business unit in some way or another is going to have some interface with information technology. I mean, if they're utilizing our network for going to the internet, for retrieving email, at some point I think there's this interaction. But if we're looking at all of the scopes as just being these each little business units, we don't have then that ability to see if we can overlap. Maybe we're duplicating efforts and wasting money that we shouldn't be. Maybe we need to work together so that we can expect better input from one business unit for another business unit, and having some of the overlap of the setups of the responsibilities. And that all together is going to be the charter, basically how we work this together. Now we need to identify and classify the assets, a very important aspect. And everything can be an asset, but some things are more important than others. And that's where we'll talk a little bit later about the classification system. We need to have objectives. What's our goal of doing the risk management? Well, obviously, many times our goal is trying to safeguard our assets to lower the risk or the exposure factor. And we also have to pick a methodology or the types of methodologies that we're going to use in the use of our risk analysis while we're talking about risk management. We have to make some choices about those methodologies. Another aspect of this whole risk management is context and purpose. Now remember, managing risks is usually the responsibility of your information security manager. So the requirements of the risk management program then is pretty much to be able to determine what are the desired outcomes and what are the objectives. Knowing the outcomes and objectives helps the security manager understand what they need to do to be able to reach those desired outcomes. And again, it's giving them a roadmap. Now, if I did not have formal risk management, then the program might become too broad and encompass all aspects of the organization, meaning that I may let the not even look at the criticality of the assets that I'm trying to protect be a part of what I would do as a security manager. I guess I can look at it this way. If I'm the security manager and I was just told, make my network secure, that's all I know. I didn't know that a certain database server had information that if lost, damaged, or destroyed would bankrupt this company. Because if I did, I might focus a little bit more on securing those aspects. So now I might say, okay, well, I'm going to go as security manager. I'm going to look at the door locks for the physical part of my security. We're going to upgrade the HVAC so that I keep the environmental part of security going well. And I guess I'll buy some firewalls and install those in there, and hopefully not jam up the bandwidth too bad for your voice over IP. And I'm just getting all over the place because my goal is, protect this stuff. And I don't have a priority. I don't have a goal. I just, have to start kind of shooting all over the place with different solutions. That means the program becomes too broad. Having the risk management in charge there, it gives me the desired outcomes and defines my objectives. And that gives me an idea. Then it says, oh, that server and that database and that server, that's of importance to you. Okay, I get that. So I might start looking at segmentation of the network and restricting access to only certain servers to be able to make connections, to find ways to look at the integrity of the data, to have logs of who's logged in and who's retrieving information and who's doing what and backing up that information. Right? And now all of a sudden I've got a game plan and I'm focusing on that outcome. Now, there of course could be some interactions between the different business units depending on your organization, and that might be still a part of what you're doing, but that doesn't then make it too broad because at that point I'm still got a goal, I have an objective, and maybe part of keeping that data safe and secure is also in the training of the people who enter the data, of having a good application that makes sure that the proper data is put in. Like if I'm putting in a customer information and it wants the date of sale and instead they type their last name, that's going to just mess things up on the back end. So, there's a lot of things we can do and to look at as far as the context and purpose, but hopefully making a point here as to the importance of risk management. Now, as I mentioned, the scope and charter part of this is that many parts of the organization might be involved with risk management. And it's important that we define the scope to understand the responsibility and authority, especially with overlaps. Now, some of the main areas in information security we deal with are going to be with physical security. Well, that very well could affect everybody that comes into that building, having ID badges and the rest. We may look at operational risk and IT and business management as far as understanding what their scope of their work and their responsibilities are. And charter generally just means, this is our contract, what we're trying to achieve. Now, the assets are one of the key factors that we look at in risk management. All of our assets need to be identified, classified, and determine the ownership of those assets. And the purpose of that is so that we can add that to the scope and the priorities for the risk management efforts. Now, as I mentioned, I talked about a database as far as information. If I lost it, it might bankrupt the company. But part of the other assets then is probably the server that is housing that database. Do I have backup copies of the software program for the database management system? Do I have backups for the network connectivity so that the information is available or highly available? And all of these, do I have the right types of access rules as far as who's allowed to look at the information? These are all things that we do when we start having a high priority of our assets and doing the classifications, because we want to focus our efforts and prioritize what we do. Now, having said that, some of the other things I just talked about, like network connectivity and the server that we're using, those are assets as well. And you know what? The fact that I mentioned them wasn't to say, how would I secure them? But, I'm asking the question, if the data is important, then the server that's holding the data must have some importance, and the communication pipes to that server must be of some importance, and so we have to prioritize all of those connectivities, and then I have to say, those are going to be more critical to our functionality than whether or not somebody can turn on their workstation and open up Microsoft Word and make some sort of correspondence. I'm not saying that's not important, but again, it's back to the prioritization of the assets. So, down the road, we might have the classification of some of those workstations as, being a part of the network, but not of the first thing or the second thing we're going to work with or have to worry about. Anyway, so there you go. You get some ideas. So what we say is when we classify is we're asking about the sensitivity and the criticality and how those relate to the importance of the organization. And that's what we have to do with our assets, because it has to help us focus the resources that we're using, which are part of risk management, and to give us the ideas of what we're trying to accomplish as far as the goals as well. Now, there are some other goals that we have with risk management. Of course, things like determining the objectives and priorities for your information risk management is absolutely essential, because without it, right, you're trying to go down a road and try to figure out what's at risk and what's important, and it's just like you don't have a game plan. So you need to have that. Now, your priorities, of course, should be determined. Since most of the organizations can't really afford to mitigate every single risk, that means that we're going to focus our risk management on those things that are very important to us. And I know you've heard me say this over and over again about the classification and trying to figure out what those assets are. And different business units may have different perspectives on that. But then again, that's part of the risk management team to come up with really coming along with the right priorities, with the right assets that they're trying to look at, and going from that process. It doesn't mean that we can't look at other assets. But again, if time's a constraint, if money's a constraint, and we're looking for those things that are essential, then that's what we want to focus on. Now, you can determine the methodologies that you want to use for the risk assessment. And we've talked about some of those already. But really, those methodologies that you choose are going to be up to your program development team. And one of the things we will have to remember is that when we start using methodologies for things like risk assessment, we want to be consistent in those methodologies. A lot of times as we're going along the path, the roadmap to getting to that desired state, if we decide to suddenly change methodologies, then what we're looking at as a desired state or the roadmap might begin to look different, and it may cause some confusion. And of course, it's also kind of hard when you're doing these evaluations with different methodologies to really know then if you've made progress, because suddenly the way in which you look at these different assets and the risks and the threats that are out there could potentially look quite a bit different to you, and then some, of course, cause some confusion in, are you really getting to your benchmarks? Are you getting to those intermediate points on your way to the roadmap? We also have to look at the roles and responsibilities. Now, information security risk management, as we said, is an important part of the entire security governance. And it's important to remember that even risk management, that it is a management responsibility. Now, ultimately, the entire security governance is the responsibility of the board of directors. And as I said, risk management is a part of that management responsibility. There are many key roles besides just the management and the upper management that we also need to address and what they're responsible for. So, as we talk about some of the roles of the governing boards or the senior management, remember, they have the ultimate responsibility. They are the ones ultimately liable for any loss or anything that happens negatively against that particular organization. Now, from there, you'll have a chief information officer. And I realize you might not go by that name, but there is that position. Their goal is to be in charge of the IT planning, the budgeting, and making sure that the department is performing as it should. Your information security manager is the one who will be working with the implementation and the development, then the implementation, the managing of your security programs for that organization. Your system and information owners, they're the ones that are really there to ensure that the controls are in place and that they're performing as they should. Being the information owner or the system owner means that we have that responsibility to know that whatever we're in charge of is performing well and that it is protected as it should be. Your business and functional managers are really out there to work with the IT procurement and your business management. That means in the purchasing of hardware, the purchasing of software, or whatever else we need to get the specific types of countermeasures in place. Overall, that's their business management. Your IT security practitioners are the ones who are actually going to be doing the implementation of controls. That means I could have people who specialize in working with firewalls and routers, with server and server technology. They have their own particular expertise, but we have to remember that they are a part of the security team, and they need to be there to make sure that the controls are implemented and working the way they're supposed to. And then we have the security awareness trainers whose jobs are to reach everybody else, to reach the employees. And that also can mean reaching the upper level management to make sure everybody understands the reason for the controls, the reasons for the way in which business is being done, why the policies and procedures, standards have been developed, and making sure everybody has an understanding so that there's not maybe a negative reaction to having to do things in a certain way, as long as people understand the purpose of it. And it's not just something that was done because somebody said, hey, that sounds like busy work, or it's that there's actually meaning behind the actions that they take. Now we're going to take a look at the information security risk management concepts. And there are a number of concepts, things that we need to understand, key concepts especially, that as an information security manager we need to be aware of. Now my goal here is to make sure you understand that it's one thing to actually do the work versus understanding the concepts of what the work does, so that you have an understanding of what to expect. Many times I enter into a lot of training environments where I'm teaching a class, and I'll ask students at the first day, it's about their experience and what they do as their job functions. And I'll have some people tell me, and I remember just recently in a high-end firewall class for one of the large vendors, and the person there said, it's been years since I've configured a router or a firewall, that I've gotten into the command line, and told me right up front, says, I'm not really here to learn how to do these configurations and to actually do the hands-on. And I was like, oh, so then what are you here for? And the answer was, that they're in the management position. And what they need to do is understand how the product works, understand the capabilities of the product, know what they can ask as expectations, in the management process of working with that technology. And that's kind of where we're at here in the Information Security Manager. I don't think it's possible to know every single aspect of every part of your organization, but you should have an understanding of what it does rather than the hands-on experience perhaps. So when we introduce these key concepts, and I give you some brief definitions or examples, it's again just so we understand at a high level what's going on. So when we have threats and vulnerabilities, well, they kind of work in a way hand in hand. First of all, the vulnerability is a weakness of some sort. If we focus on software, we often talk about bugs in the programs and having the, somebody do a buffer overflow attack and being able to remotely access this machine and give out system level commands and do what we call owning the box. Other vulnerabilities could just be in things like physical security, finding points of entry that we might not have thought about. We talk about your server room, that the walls surrounding it should be true walls that go all the way from the real ceiling to the real floor, so that somebody can't just climb over through the ceiling panels, because that could be an example of a vulnerability. So it's important that we look at vulnerabilities in general as weaknesses. Now the threats, of course, are people or something taking advantage of that vulnerability. Certainly, yes, my brick and mortar building may be vulnerable to flame and fire. But there needs to be a threat. What would cause that? It could be electrical shortages. It could be arson. But those are threats that we look at that are taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. And just because I have a vulnerability doesn't mean that somebody's going to act on it. But we have to look at those potential threats. And of course, the risk is that there is a threat that actually takes advantage of a vulnerability. And when it does, we talk about that as an exploit, exploiting the vulnerability. Exposures are, again, something we look at. A lot of times we talk about the exposure factor, which is kind of letting us know to the extent to which damage might be done. And again, damage doesn't necessarily mean it was purposeful or malicious. It could be from accidental deletion of a database, of files, of customer accounts. What would that exposure happen, or what would it cost our company? Obviously, as we put all of these together, the threats and vulnerabilities, somebody exploiting that, causing an exposure, we call those risks, and obviously those risks have impacts into what happens to our organization. Ways of lowering those risks of the threats and the vulnerabilities is through the use of controls and countermeasures. Now we're going to see a lot of use of the term controls, and when we talk about controls, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a device that I bought or a software program that I installed. Those are more in the category of the actual countermeasures that we use. Sometimes we call them targeted controls. But as we talk about controls, they often start off with the policy. And the policy is giving us the guidance that creates the standards that help us put in the boundaries so we can stay on target to meeting that policy. And as we look at the actions, we may have a set of procedures that we must follow. So controls put us into the ideas of having the policies, the standards, and the guidelines and the procedures. Now, we've made mention probably enough times that you're tired of hearing about it, but asset classification is a part of one of these key concepts. And I think we've hopefully discussed that well enough that you have the good understanding of what that means. Now, some other things that we look at are things like recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. All right, those sound very similar other than the time and the point. So recovery time is our way of talking about the length of time it would take to come back from some sort of event happening. And that gets us into a lot of things where we talk about our backup procedures, our restore procedures, having hot sites that we can move equipment over to if we need to, or personnel to bring things back up. Again, recovery time objectives. We want to understand conceptually what that means to us, because that's also going to probably be a part of our security program. The recovery point objectives is another interesting idea. If I use an example of a database and I realize that somebody has deleted perhaps a customer account, and I need to recover that customer's information, the question is if I look at my backups, would I have to recover that customer information from like a year ago, or can I recover that customer up to a certain point of time? Or if maybe I made a change and I just need to roll back the change, do I have the ability to go to a specific point? So that's part of the recovery points. And of course, our service delivery objectives it really is kind of a part of sometimes what we're expecting either from our service providers or what's expected of us to deliver. A lot of times that goes into our contractual agreements. We also should take a look at the different technologies, again, having that overview. So an information security manager should have a good conceptual understanding of some of the following things like application security. Now, when we talk about application security, we can look at it from many different perspectives. It could be very well, does the application run? Does it have bugs? Does it crash? Are there known flaws that we try to work around because if we don't do it, the information or the data can't be trusted or worthwhile? Now, that's a lot of different things in there, right? Bugs in the application, the output of the application not being accurate, that would be disastrous for us. But we also can look at application security as well as from what we might call fuzzing attacks, where people put in purposely bad information to see if they can make it break or to see how it reacts. Some people may use your web applications as a way to issue commands to your database server to do disastrous things within your network. So those are all aspects that you might look at from when we say application security. And you'll notice that I'm looking at things about how it functions, how it works, what its output looks like, and how people can exploit that particular application. We can say the same thing with physical security as well. When we talk about that, we have to remember the old adage is that if I can touch it, I own it. And that's very true. When it comes to routers, switches, firewalls, hardware devices, almost all of them have on their own public websites the steps I would go through to do password recovery, and almost every single one of them I know results in my having to have physical contact with the device so that I can appropriately manipulate its controls, its outside or front panel, while making a connection to be able to do that break-in. Other aspects of physical security could be from the theft of items. A lot of people invest money in cable locks for their laptops so that people won't walk away with a whole laptop. But if I'm a hacker and I'm after the data, I don't care if I smash your laptop into pieces. I want the hard drive that's in it. So some of those aspects. Again, I'm just trying to point in directions of how you might look at physical security. You may also look at things like entry doors, whether piggybacking is allowed. The availability of having guards or people that you register with, access cards, and the rest of it. Your environmental control is also very important. Obviously, electronic equipment does not do very well at high temperatures. Unless you have a fire, I'm not expecting that you're going to melt something, but performance certainly does begin to degrade as components get too hot, and it can cause permanent damage to the actual system boards. Likewise, we can have environments that have too much humidity, causing corrosion, too little humidity, causing the availability of static electricity. And yes, it is possible for you to, through a static charge, to destroy system boards and other hardware devices. So all of those are examples of things we would look at environmentally, as well as, of course, power supply, the condition of the power. If there's a lot of line noise in the power, or if there's a lot of surges or brownouts. Your logical and network access controls. So logically, a lot of these controls are things you might see like signing in, passwords, usernames. Network access controls could be devices that look for biometrics. A lot of these I'm describing are authentication measures. But part of access control is having proper authentication and then having the authorization, knowing what you're allowed to do. Network equipment is a very vague or very, very broad term. Network equipment, you could even make the argument, is your operating systems for your network devices, your servers. Certainly the routers, the switches, the firewalls, repeaters, wireless access points, on and on it goes. Each of them have their own issues that we should be familiar with as far as what they're capable of doing and areas that we want to be familiar about weaknesses. Specifically in the network equipment, I did talk about some things that might be classified as your security equipment. Security equipment, though, is not just technological, right? It's not just firewalls, intrusion detection, antivirus scanning. Security equipment can also be the type of locks that you use on the doors. As one example, I do a lot of training in the realm of ethical hacking. We had an advanced class that we used, and we actually taught people how to pick the locks on your regular tumbler doorknobs. And you'd be surprised that in 30 minutes time, I can teach an entire class how to be able to easily pick those tumbler locks and to gain entry to any facility that has that kind of security. So that might be another type of security equipment. Taking care of data when it's in motion and at rest. We talk about that a lot, that it needs to be safe. We do that through encryption technologies usually. And there's a variety of types of encryption technologies. A lot of different protocols or algorithms, I should say, that we can use for encryption. A lot of options we have for how we encrypt things when it's stored, how we encrypt communications. Malware seems to be something that I think we all can relate to. That's a broad category of your viruses, Trojans, worms, on it goes. It's software generally that's doing things that you either don't know about or didn't approve. And we have a whole new realm of things we have to be careful of when we're talking about technologies, and that's telecommunications. Now, when I say it's a whole new realm, we are seeing a big push into moving voice traffic into the data network. And as such, that means that we now have, we have eliminated some risks that we may have had if we had a regular PBX or other type of outside line. But we have a new set of risks, that we have to look at that deal with the regular data traffic moving across our networks, which, your voice messages are turned into regular data packets. But, I can take the telecommunications and probably expand it from there. We're seeing, a huge increase in smartphones, phones that can, connect to your own network through VPNs. I realize, as an example, Juniper has a little technology app that you can use on your smartphone to create a secure VPN connection back into the network. So this device is something I may want to be careful of as well, as it introduces new risks or new points of access. Telecommunications, again, with voice over IP, could move into the world of pads, all sorts of great things that are very helpful for our network, but can bring in a new set of risks that we need to evaluate. This domain is entitled the Information Risk Management. And what we're going to take a look at is a lot of processes that deal with all facets of risk management. We're going to talk about establishing a process for your information asset classification and ownership, implementing a systematic and structured information risk assessment process to ensure that business impact assessments are done periodically. We'll take a look at making sure that the threat and vulnerability evaluations are performed. Talk about identifying and periodically evaluating information security controls and countermeasures to help mitigate risk to your acceptable levels. We're also going to talk about integrating risk, threat, and vulnerability identification and management into a life cycle process. And then talk about ways of reporting any significant changes in information for the risk so that we can make sure that we can, again, analyze that risk and try to get to the appropriate levels of risk acceptance that management can approve. We're going to begin by taking an overview look at risk management. Now, it's pretty basic that risk management is the attempt to optimize the balance between your opportunities for gain and minimizing vulnerabilities and loss. So having said that, it's kind of the idea that without risk management, if you think about it, we really won't be able to say, what can we do to understand, number one, what the risks are, And if all we say is, let's just throw money at some solutions because everybody says that we need firewalls and intrusion detection and antivirus software and, let's just put it all on. Well, now you've just thrown out money, you've purchased some things, you've got people busy. Did it do you any good? Right? Did it really minimize the vulnerabilities and the loss that you could incur? Were any of those even issues that you had to deal with as far as the potential threats to your network or to your assets in case it's other than just the information itself? So what we tell people is that risk management as well as your business impact analysis are mandatory if you want to have a good security strategy. Because what they do is they identify, number one, what is important, what's a critical component of your particular business. And knowing what those critical assets are, we can then say, okay, what threats could there be? And how frequent could those threats occur? And what kind of damage or exposure factor might that cause? And knowing all of that information through risk management, then we're like, okay, now we know where the threats are, we know what we have to come up against, we know what we have to mitigate, and now we can come up with a strategy to protect those assets. So really, your risk management is your framework for your policies, procedures, practices, and guidelines that you're going to implement in your security strategy. Now, when we talk about the types of risk analysis, really, our goal is that we're going to try to find some controls, things that we use to help reduce risk. And those are going to be controls that we find as a part of our risk management that we might use as part of the analysis to say, is this a good control? Will it do what it's supposed to and mitigate the risk? Now, at the same time, controls might also, as it says, present a good return on your investment. Or should, I should say, it should present a good return on your investment. All right, that's an important aspect. I mean, you could over-purchase or even under-purchase. If it doesn't even do close to what you want, it wasn't worth a quarter. And if you over-purchase, you might get to the point of security that you like, but your return on investment might not be so great. So what we do is we have some options, and we say two types, even though we list three. Really, there's just two types of risk analysis options that we're going to use. And those are to help us determine the proper controls. And those ways that we have, number one is the quantitative approach, which is all about money. I might say it's a numerical approach, but it's all about dollars, having actual values. And then we have the qualitative, which is opinions, where, I might send out surveys with check boxes that you can choose your thoughts. Now, very popularly being used is a semi-quantitative, which is technically a hybrid, a combination of a qualitative and quantitative. Now, on a qualitative, you might very well just have, it could be as simple as having some categories and, saying, we have an option of using a firewall, intrusion detection prevention, or antivirus software, and we'd like your opinion of a rating of 1 to 5 for each of these categories about how well you think it'll protect the database and how well you think it'll protect the server. And so, people can say, well, maybe the firewall ranks a 4 out of 5 and intrusion detection maybe a 2. And on the server, I really think you should have antivirus software. And so you can kind of give opinion ratings that kind of coincide with the qualitative. Now, that's not an exact qualitative study, but in just trying to diagram some examples, you can see that it is open to a lot of subjection. And it depends on who am I when I'm making this decision. Am I a firewall specialist when I made this chart or response? Am I a server operator? Am I, a manager of some kind? So, it's mostly, like I said, an opinion or scenario-based type of an approach. Quantitative uses numerical values, and we started off with basically the value of the asset. And I've used this as an example before to talk about, having a facility that we want to keep safe from fire. So we're going to give that facility a value of $1 million. I'm going to be brave and see if I can do this math. And part of this quantitative study is we say, okay, we need to determine what is your exposure factor. So if we're worried about a fire, and we have determined from buildings of similar construction, similar material, similar location, and we have no sprinkler systems in our building, we've decided that our exposure factor is about 50% loss if there is a fire. And so having done that, then we know that for any one event, the single loss expectancy would be about $500,000. Now, the reason that quantitative is not necessarily used by itself and qualitative not used just by itself, and people are favoring the semi-quantitative is, I'm talking about the cost of a building. There are many other add-ons that you would have to worry about, right? Because now we have loss of production. People can't get to work. The building's not inhabitable. Maybe we've lost some reputation because we're not getting our products out. We may have lost even business partners because they were relying on us and they've had to move somewhere else. And so when we start checking these things off, we're adding to the fact that we really can't put pure numbers into these cases, and we have to start thinking about those maybe from a qualitative standpoint, besides just having lost $500,000 worth of property. All right, well, back to the quantitative. So now that we have this value down, the next thing you might ask then is, okay, let's look at the rate of occurrence of how often this occurs. And I keep using these easy numbers. I tell you, if this was true, if I told you that the odds of a fire in your building was once out of every 10 years for an annualized rate of occurrence, I don't think I'd ever go into your building. Or I'd make sure I was on the bottom floor by a window that I can open, I guess. So that means that 1 out of 10 chance each year. So each year there's a 10% chance of a fire, which means that I could expect what we call an annualized loss expectancy of $50,000 in a year. Now, maybe I've decided to add a control, and the control I'm going to use is to put in sprinkler systems. And let's say that control is going to cost me $5,000 to be able to put that in. But if I do put that in with a $5,000, my exposure factor is going to go down to 10% instead of 50% of a loss. So what would that do for me? Well, what happens then is I start off with the value of that resource again at $1 million. And I know now that my exposure factor is equal to 10%. So now I'm at a $100,000 loss for a single loss expectancy. I still know that the fire rate didn't change, so I know that my annualized loss expectancy is now $10,000. And if I factor in that $5,000 over that same 10-year time period, then I'm talking about $500 that it's going to cost me. So I'm going to add that $500 on there to the cost of the control for my loss. But I guess you could say now is, if my $5,000 investment worth the savings annually of $40,000 in risk? And that's where you can then get kind of the idea, is it a good return on investment? And certainly this is a very simplistic form, but it's just trying to describe some of these different types of risk analysis that you might be involved with. So I guess it's important that we understand why risk management is up there at the top of the list of what we need to do. Well, number one, risk management drives the logic for all of your information security activities. It's really one of your keys to being able to manage the regulatory requirements. I mean, if we think about it, if we have regulatory requirements to say that we need to be secure for certain things and meet certain standards, we need to kind of have an idea, where are we? And risk management can help me understand where we currently are in our state of security. And knowing where I am and knowing where I need to be provides for me the ability at some point to create a roadmap that says, okay, I want to get from this current state to that desired state, but it starts with the risk management. Without it, it'd be very, almost impossible to determine, what the potential cost of an impact of any event is going to be, to even know where I am to get to where I need to go to meet those requirements. Now, your risk management can be influenced, of course, by things like the culture of the company, people having a bias if this is how we've always done things. Cultures, maybe if it's a multinational focused company. Obviously, your company is involved in making certain products or producing something or finding a way to make a profit. So your risk management may also be influenced by the company's mission and objectives for its products and services. Again, very important to understand that our eventual security strategy has to be in alignment with the business objectives, because if it's not, if we somehow make our strategy more important than the business objectives, there's no more money coming in for that business, and there's no more need for security strategy. I guess in a way you've solved the problem, but not probably in a great way. And of course, your physical and environmental and regulatory conditions all are going to have an influence on how the risk is managed. And again, it's a part of the process that we're going to be going through. So now risk management, of course, is going to be part of managing your risk assessments, your business impact analysis, and putting it together and making it in alignment with your overall strategy. Now, the main goal of risk management is to really minimize the impact of an event. Now, in order to do that, you need to know some things. Number one, understanding the risk profile of the company. Understanding the risk profile, part of that is kind of understanding their appetite for residual risk or their approach to risk. Their risk profile may be of trying to do risk transference, buying insurance. If that's what they want to do for their risk profile, that's okay. I need to know that as a part of my way of managing risk. If I am trying to reduce risk, I need to know what are they willing to still accept as residual risk, because we can't get rid of all risk altogether. We also need to understand what are the potential consequences of any asset being compromised. What would that do to the company? What would happen, if we chose the wrong priorities? If we said, let's protect this email server so we can always get email, and not worrying about the database of customer credit card accounts. Maybe we have the wrong priorities in there as well. So it's important we understand those priorities. And we also have a way of measuring where we are and how we're doing. So we need to have metrics that our resources can look at, and they should be appropriate, as well as letting us know if the controls that we've chosen are also appropriate and cost effective. I mean, we need a method of measuring those outcomes so we can see how things are functioning. To be effective, your risk management should be integrated in the business process. Again, it should be consistent and integrated into the overall security governance strategy. And that should be in line with the business strategy. So let's put it together. I can't make a business strategy, really, unless I have a good security governance strategy, because I may, you could have a business strategy without one, but you run into the risk of losing a lot of information, having a lot of problems, not meeting regulations. But before I can even get a good security governance strategy to try to work with the business strategy, I need to know, what am I looking at? What are the problems? What are the risks? What are the threats? So I guess in a way, going backwards like that, risk management kind of starts this process off. Without good risk management, I really am not going to be very good at coming up with a security governance strategy. If I don't have a good security governance strategy, it doesn't matter if I try to make it in alignment with a business strategy. I'm probably failing the overall goal of the business, especially if part of the business strategy is to maintain certain certifications, security certifications, and certain regulatory requirements. So I'm hoping you kind of see how the pieces of this puzzle fit together. Now, the issues regarding risk management must be communicated throughout the organization, as well as to all the stakeholders, because stakeholders need to understand that a couple of things. What are we doing as a company to reduce risk, to help protect their investments? Whether they're invested because they are shareholders, invested because they're employees and they want to continue working. We need to talk about the residual risks. And again, so this is something that needs to be communicated with everyone, besides just senior management and the board of directors. We're going to take a look at implementing risk management. Now, as we've said, for effective information security risk management, for it to not be bypassed or subverted, then there must be an effective process for the implementation, and that process should be established. Now, you have to think about this as you kind of digest that statement, that during implementation, it is possible that we can bypass a lot of our security or subvert it as we're trying to come to that point where we get to that desired state of security. And in that process, we also have to realize how far-reaching it might be and what we have to look for. So we're going to talk about the implementation, and just on the outside, what we kind of just mentioned, although maybe not directly, is that there's even risk involved in implementing risk management. Even risk in doing the risk management incorrectly, again, being able to bypass or subvert some of the results. All right, so what do we need for implementing? Now, the process of risk management often has a few concepts, things that we need to look at, or terms. Things like scope and boundaries, which you could talk about as your global parameters. Remember, we're trying to avoid having specific business units sitting as their own little silos, that we want to realize that there may be some overlapping duties, some overlapping functions, but we still need to make sure, at least when we are working with risk management, that we know what those scopes and boundaries are. Through that process, we have risk assessment, which is the identification of risk, the risk analysis, and even the risk evaluation. The risk treatment would be our strategies that we use to deal with any of the identified risks that we have. Having the acceptance of residual risk is a management decision that is part of our goal of what we're trying to manage, which is getting risk reduced down to a level that the organization has the appetite to accept. And of course, risk communication and monitoring is the ability for us to exchange information that we've learned about this process of risk management to all of the people that have the associated roles and responsibilities. When we look at risk management, there are a number of frameworks that we can use. Now, often we use a framework as a reference model. Now, a framework just means that somebody has a plan about how you can manage risk, and there are many different options that are out there. But it is just that, as a reference model. That means that we would use that as a framework, as a starting point, rather than creating our own from scratch, from the ground up. And we can adapt, the ones that we have into the organization, and use that information as a way of helping guide us to what our desired states are going to be. Now, there are a lot of existing models to choose from. Regardless of the models that you choose, they have a lot of things in common. Often they deal with things like policy. Now, again, policies are generally statements that are pretty brief, that are talking about what our end goal is going to be and what we're trying to achieve. We have planning and resourcing as a part of these models. And that's a very important part of it, because, again, overall risk management, as with any project, there is some planning that's entailed, of course, and whether or not we have the resources or trying to deal with resources is either an advantage or a constraint. At some point when we're done with the planning stage, the development stage, sometimes we call it, we have the implementation program. So a lot of these frameworks talk about methods of getting through that process. And once implemented and running, it does need to be managed. It does need to be maintained and monitored. So there are options for management review. And also, when we're completely done, and in fact, not even just when we're done, but through this entire process, we should have adequate documentation of what's happening. And so part of this framework might include the risk management process and the risk management documentation. I think, again, all very crucial parts. But remember, it is a guideline or a reference model that you can use in building your risk management for your organization. Part of what we want to look at is the external environment, because the external environment, when it comes to risk management, can really affect or even add to the definition of risk management. Things like understanding the local market, if that's at all applicable to your organization. Issues dealing with competition. These are big issues, right? Because competition means, we don't want, what's the saying we say in sales? We don't want somebody else to steal our lunch. Competition, we don't want the we hope anyway, the other companies don't pass us or do better than us or send worse off people in to spy or to try to copy what you're doing. The financial and political environment can have a lot to do with the influence on risk management. Obviously, your regulatory laws are certainly a part of it, things that we can't get around that we have to make sure that we're following. The social and cultural conditions. And here we've talked a lot about the culture internally, but of course there's also the external environment that may have a lot to say with it. There have certainly been a lot of news stories about some organizations having groups of people who are against what they do. I hear about the big blank type of company. I don't want to pick on any industry because that's not my game at all. But we hear some of these sayings about, how your product is hurting this part of our world or this group of people. And some of those might have some influence on your risk management. And obviously your external stakeholders, those who have a vested interest in what your company does, may even have some say even over who's managing it in the board of directors, as well as your external stakeholders may even be your customers, and they have some influence on what you're doing with risk management as well. Realize also the internal environment will have some impact onto the risk management. And again, especially when we're looking at the risk assessment, we have to take a look at things like what are the business drivers, like the market competitive advances that are going on. And that, of course, is a broad statement because there is so many different types of businesses out there. But needless to say, there may be some things that are making this business work, or the world of, for example, I throw this one out here because it's still the case: web page design. Many times there have been big problems with web page designs, such as security breaches, because the business drivers were such that they had to get up first and big, and everybody can see them because it's a competition. We want to be as up to date, cutting edge, bleeding edge, some people might say, and sometimes those business drivers may force us to publish information that might not be right, or web pages or applications that don't work well. In fact, when I'm thinking about it, I remember back in the days back in the year 2000. It's amazing that's over 10 years ago. But there was this whole controversy over voting machines and the paper ballot and the hanging chads. And so one company was trying to come first to the market with a electronic voting system, and it was found to have so many bugs that anybody who walked up to it could probably have broken in, altered the votes. But the business driver was to be first to the market. So we have to consider that might have an effect on our business risk assessment. Obviously, of course, we also have to know what the existing strengths and weaknesses are, as well as emerging opportunities for this business. The internal stakeholders have their culture again. Now, there we are, of course, talking to people with an invested interest in how the company works from being an employee, perhaps. We also need to be aware of what available assets we have, and remember that our goal still is to support the business objectives. Now, there is a context for risk management, and to actually find the context means that we have to define some of the things, like what is the organization's processes or activities, the things that we need to assess. We also have to ask questions about the duration of these processes, the scope of the risk management activities, and what are the roles and responsibilities for those that are going to be involved in this entire management process. And having that in context. And duration, by the way, may also really be looked at as the duration that we have to work on the risk management, right? So, we have timelines, we have deadlines, and so those are going to have some effect on how we do our risk assessment. And, of course, that's a part of what we have to deal with in risk management.
So when we get to the term gap analysis, it's a term you're going to see quite frequently. And the concept of gap analysis is always going to be the same. It's just a matter of where you are and where you want to be, and it's just applied to whether you're creating maybe a new incident response management plan, or whether you're making a new type of control or adding a new control. But basically, the context for it here in risk management is to think about. So with risk management, we've identified a risk. We've hopefully determined what's a good countermeasure or a way to mitigate that risk. And so what we basically are saying is, at this point, we're looking at the gap between the controls that we're going to use, the controls or the countermeasures, and what the control objectives are. In other words, if you were to buy a new firewall that had all of these features, these bells and whistles of some of these next generation firewalls, you probably purchased it because you saw that there was a need. It had the ability to mitigate the risk, but just installing it is not going to get you there. There's often, going to be configurations and everything else and testing. So at some point, then you have the control and the control objectives, and so that's what the gap is. And they should be developed, the objectives, as here I say as a consequence of trying to create an information security governance and strategy. And again, some of the control objectives that you put out there could change based on what you've found in the risk management. It could be based on the types of exposures to the potential of a threat. It might be for business objectives. Again, always thinking about business needs first. That's always our first one. Or perhaps maybe some regulatory law has changed or been updated or added, and with new regulations, you now have to make sure you can get into compliance with those regulations. And you might be able to do that by creating these control objectives that basically, help you say, okay, my control can do this. I just have to get it to that point, and then we'll be in compliance, and that would, again, be the gap, where you are versus where you want to go. Now, some of the other, I guess that's always a good category, isn't it? Other organizational support. So there are, in this security industry, in all aspects of the security industry, many different types of subscription services that we can integrate into an information security program. And the services are there to help leverage the expertise of external service providers without making them responsible for it. In other words, you might see, depending on the vendor, good practices organization. I mean, even if I weren't to say, go to organizations like ASACA or maybe SANS or ISC squared. I won't put the little square on there. Anyway, those are organizations that have generally good practices that you can incorporate into the overall program. Now, I would still say you also want to include what your vendor of the different controls, operating systems, software, also recommend as good practices in concert with looking at these other good organizational or good practice organizations. Another thing we can do, of course, is look at security networking roundtables. Those are usually organizations that try to gather information, and so that's what they do, right? Roundtable. It's almost like a discussion. It doesn't mean we're all in the same room, but they're going to gather information from other security professionals from the same industries and try to organize discussions around topics of common interest so that, I call it learning from others. And we can do that. Because, if we have these roundtables and we have, now, again, this is not the same as giving out corporate secrets, certainly. It's not the same as social engineering where you're worried that somebody's asking questions about your security systems to try to figure out how to defeat them. I mean, it could be, but, usually it's trusted individuals. But somebody else might have had a similar problem that you're running into. And isn't that a great place to be able to have a roundtable and to be able to do that kind of comparison? Of course, there's lots of security training organizations that are available. These are institutions that provide classes on technical topics in information security. They could, even the ones I just mentioned, like ASACA. They certainly offer or have the ability to sponsor training so that you can learn about information systems, whether it's auditing or management. Again, SANS has a lot of more network-oriented security information about current threats, hackers and countermeasures. And sometimes, though, they also focus on showing you how to be a good hacker. But there's nothing wrong with that because then you can use those skills to test the security through an audit process and make sure that you're, again, at that certain target that you want to be at. But, they could be there just to teach you about vulnerabilities. And, again, going into some of these other organizations, they may be able to keep you up to date as well. And so here we are talking about vulnerabilities, the Vulnerability Alerting Service. And, these are, again, just services that allow you to maintain a list of technology that you use and get the news and updates regarding to the types of new threats or vulnerability. And that's important. And again, you can go to these, like SANS would certainly have that. A lot of places, if you just in fact don't know of a good place to start looking for these updates, just do a search on the internet for the term CVE. And that's going to get you into, unfortunately, you may or may not be able to subscribe based on the technology you're using. So you may get a lot of updates that might not be pertinent to you. But it's a way of you getting that type of information that should be able to help you know what you need to look for as you continue to modify, perhaps, your security program.
Now, when we talk about risk analysis, as we've stated before, there are many approaches to doing the overall risk assessment. But risk analysis is the process of analyzing the threat landscape and the vulnerabilities of the organization's assets. Now, risk analysis is really the combining of your vulnerability information from the assessment and the relative threats that have been gathered from other sources to determine the risk of compromise as well as the magnitude of the threat. So hopefully you're kind of getting the idea that, under risk management, we looked at risk assessment and we talked about a lot of frameworks for coming up with the information that we need. But, from there we actually do the real analysis so that we get an idea, you've said in your assessment, here's a vulnerability, and we have some ideas of what the threats are. But now what I want to know is what is the relative degree that that threat could actually work, that it could be there. And if it did succeed, if it was realized, we want to know, what is the magnitude, right, the exposure factor of that particular threat. So we're actually trying to put the hard values, whether quantitative or qualitative, into being able to say, all right, based on this assessment from our analysis, this is what we see. These are the potential outcomes. Now let's take a look at the risk assessment. Now, if you remember again that this is the first step of risk assessment is really the assessment of what's important to the organization. I bet you haven't heard that before because I just said it in a different way. It's back to the classification of the assets to have the ratings of criticality, of importance. Now, there are a lot of different risk management models that you can use and approaches that you can use. And the goal, again, is to help you, give you a framework, if you would, of methods or models that help you go through the process of risk assessment. I suppose one way to think of it is, rather than creating your own from the ground up, you're going to save a lot of time, effort, and energy by using trusted models, depending, of course, on the organization that best matches your organization, but these trusted models as a framework or a guideline to give you something to work with. Now, COBIT obviously has quite a few that we have looked at, or at least mentioned before, as far as the models that you can use. There's also Octave, the NIST has theirs, and even the International Standards Organization, ISO. Now, one of the things that they have in common, or many of the things that all of these models have in common, is that they all are designed to assess, to evaluate, and to rank your risk. We can take a look as an example of the NIST risk assessment methodology. And there's really 9 steps that they have in their methodology. Now again, remember this is your model, kind of your outline that helps you in deciding how to go about your risk assessment. Number 1 is they may start off with the system characterization. Now there is the description of the system or the asset perhaps of what we're worried about. Now in that process we have to be able to figure out what are the threats, and that is the threat identification. And again, remember that threats can be from a variety of different things. Natural disasters, as we've talked about, accidental damage, malicious threats of damage, outside forces, loss of electrical power, power grids, even acts of war, I suppose. All right, so we look at those threats. We have to identify what those are. And then we also have to identify what our vulnerabilities are. And of course, as we just said, the analysis is kind of the combination of what are the threats and what are the vulnerabilities, and what would the outcome be. But that's the analysis part. The risk assessment is helping gather this information. Now, the other thing we can do is try to figure out what controls we have, what are in place, what might we need, so that it would be part of the control analysis. And again, controls, generally we look at them as the policies, the standards, the procedures, and the guidelines. Whereas the actual countermeasure is something that we said was a targeted control. Now, out of all of that, we also have to remember that one other aspect was the likelihood. Remember I used the example of saying, well, there's a threat that a comet or meteor could fall out of the sky and destroy our facility. Okay, yeah, that's a valid threat. But, when I rank it with likelihood, then we can probably say, that's one we'll just shelve and worry about later on. But if I live on a fault plane and somebody says, earthquakes are bound to happen, then I'm thinking, okay, there's a higher likelihood, something we should look at. Now, of course, if this vulnerability was exploited, by whatever threat it is that we're looking at, we have to look at also the impact analysis. Now, that's an important aspect, right? We want to know, what is that exposure factor? What could it mean to our company? And when we talk about impact analysis, there we can get into the discussions about dependencies, about how things could cascade or get even worse from one outage. Risk determination is another aspect of the risk assessment. Also, part of what we'll do is make recommendations for the types of controls. And once all of this is put together through the assessment process, and it doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't add other steps into this methodology. It's just, again, it's an outline of a methodology, a model that you can use, one of many, as we just mentioned. But when it's done, you should have the results documented. Now, the documentation is an important aspect. It's not just because that's the document that we may be getting paid to produce, especially if you're an outside consultant. Often that's the payable. That's what we're getting paid on of those results. But it's designed to outline clearly what we found and what are some ideas, and giving us basically that working document that helps us eventually come up with a security program to understand what we're trying to achieve. And again, this is a great way of looking at where we are in our current state by having this risk assessment. Because the risk assessment is our current state. What are we doing right now? Especially when we look to what we want to be doing. So again, if we don't know where we're starting, it's hard to get to that destination. And this helps us in that starting point. Now, a part of the looking at risk is this idea of aggregation or cascading risk. Now, you could say that some threats could affect a large number of minor vulnerabilities, but if you take them in total or aggregated, it could have a major impact. Okay, I'm going to go back in my time machine again and talk about a little piece of malware called Blaster. Now, Blaster really didn't do anything bad to our systems. It spread like crazy. It was a very good as far as being a worm and being able to perpetuate itself. But what it did is it ordered our Windows machine to attack a Microsoft website. All right, so there was a vulnerability. Because of a vulnerability in the Windows operating system, this code was able to do this very action. And even though it was pretty minor, something we might not even noticed or paid attention to, because it hit several 100,000 machines, when you took it as a whole, the Microsoft website that was being attacked with a denial of service took it as a pretty serious threat, and it had a very major impact. It took that server down. Now, one failure, another part of the cascading risk idea, is saying that one failure from a successful threat could cause a cascading chain reaction that sometimes I like to call the ripple effect. If you understand the ripple effect, you throw a stone into a lake, and that little dip into the water starts sending out these little ripples or waves that will affect everything else that's floating around, right? So they feel the effects of it. In the last few weeks, and I think I may have mentioned this already, a major air carrier claims anyway, this is what I can glean from the news, that they had a power outage at one of their sites. And now this one failure, which by the way is a threat, one of our threats should be in the power supply, caused a cascading chain reaction in that it basically took off all of these airport hubs and check-in places offline, that they lost computer or network connectivity, and they couldn't take care of the existing passengers are okay, but they couldn't check in new passengers. Apparently, the computer systems couldn't create flight plans so that the planes couldn't legally take off without filing a flight plan. And one incident, from what the news says anyway, had a very huge ripple effect that affected hundreds of flights, which in turn affected thousands of people. And of course, by the time they got it back online, now with that extra, group of passengers trying to shove them into all the other upcoming flights, you can just imagine it was a pretty big mess. But I think that makes a good example of what we mean by the ripple effect. Now, there are some other risk assessment approaches. One of them is called FAIR, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk. Now, it is a taxonomy which gives us an understanding of the information risk by looking at it in the different pieces. Number one, of course, and this sounds very familiar. You're going to notice I said that a lot of these models have a lot of things in common. So the pieces and parts, the taxonomy of FAIR, are things like the frequency of the threat, the probability of the threat, the probability of the success of that threat, and the actual output as far as what is the probable nature of the impact. What's its output going to be? What's its damage going to be? Now, a part of what it is, and by the way, that is just one of 4 parts of FAIR, is the taxonomy. The other thing that it does is it has a method for measuring. It also has computational engines, which is mathematical routines to help you in the decisions about impacts and also being able to take the input of measurements. And it also includes a simulation model where we can take a look at different situations and use it either for the decision about things like the impact, probability of success, or maybe through the use of controls to try to mitigate that risk. Now, there are some other risk assessment approaches. One's called the risk factor analysis. It's a model or an approach that's being undertaken and developed at the Los Alamos nuclear facilities. One is another one that you might see, the PRA, the probabilistic risk assessment. Now, that's a systematic and comprehensive method to evaluate risk, but designed for very complex systems. A complex system very well could be nuclear facilities. It could be the airline industry. Now, you think about complexity, right? Because there we have ticketing, we have boarding, we have passengers' flights, flight plans, multiple airports, or even if you think about it as the air traffic control and the sheer number of planes in the air at any one time. Those tend to be very complex systems that may need a different approach than some of our other traditional models for doing risk assessment. Now, when we look at PRA, it does its risk characterization with 2 different quantities. Those quantities are the severity of the consequences and the likelihood of the event. Now, there are usually 3 basic questions that are answered when we're doing something like the PRA, and that is, what can go wrong? And the next question we might ask is, what and how severe would be the consequences? And then how likely is the occurrence? So those are some of the ideas of what it's doing. Now, you might notice that this sounds very high level. And sometimes one of the ways to approach a complex system is by taking maybe a little bit more of a higher level approach. Or, of course, breaking it down into its smaller components and going through the same risk assessment. Now, as you can tell, one of the major themes in all of the discussions we had about assessment is the identification of risk. And that means that as a risk management program, we should have a company's list of sources of their threats, vulnerabilities, and risks. Now, in general, when we talk about a risk can be related or characterized by things about its origin. Or maybe it's a certain activity, an event, or an incident. And again, we talk about a lot about threats, and so this kind of feels like the threat. But remember, the risk is kind of that combination of the threat and that vulnerability. Other things we identify or characterize your risk as we've said, is the consequences, the results, or the impact it's going to have on the organization. We should also look at the reason for its occurrence and start looking at protective controls to not only see, basically know what they are, but how well or how effective they might be in lowering or mitigating that risk. And of course, some risks may be characterized by their time and occurrence. Now, in the term of threats, you've heard me say lots of different examples of threats. And of course, I've talked a lot about natural events, the floods and the earthquakes. Unintentional events. Well, you could make an argument that fires are generally unintentional. We don't often plan them unless we're an arsonist. But any number of things can happen that may cause that to occur. Other unintentional threats could very well just be, again, power outages. I remember not too many years ago that the service provider I used for my email systems and my website was based in a large city. And they had some sort of event, something unintentional occur that caused a power line to go down. And the automatic rerouting of power on the grid apparently overwhelmed this grid and caused an 8-state-wide shutdown of power. That lasted for nearly half a day. All right, so I don't know what the original outage was that caused this redirect, but that certainly sounds to me like something that was unintentional. Now, we could, of course, have intentional types of attacks that might be physically involved, or intentional ones that are non-physical. When I go back to unintentional, it doesn't even have to be something like the power grid. It could just be somebody accidentally deleting a file, deleting a folder, deleting a database. Well, hopefully they didn't do that accidentally. But when we get into some of the intentional things, well, physical intentional might be theft. It could be malicious injury, arson, as I just mentioned before. Physically stealing equipment such as your laptops or your hard drives. Your intentional non-physical would probably get us more into the hacker realm, where people are breaking into your systems, trying to take over your networks, taking advantages of known vulnerabilities to do what we call owning the box, and being able to steal information or use your own equipment against you. Now, these threats usually are relying on there being a vulnerability or a weakness. Now, remember that a vulnerability is not a true or false condition. It can have different degrees. In other words, we're not saying you either are vulnerable or you're not vulnerable, but you may have some degree of different types of vulnerabilities. And it's important to estimate the degree of vulnerability, and that can only be done through testing or by having a group of subject matter experts who can be able to talk about how bad that might be. Now, examples of vulnerabilities could certainly be defective software. Now, defective software doesn't mean that suddenly there's a bug in it and somebody's going to exploit it with a buffer overflow and own that program. I mean, it could mean that. But remember, I mentioned that part of of the assets, especially information assets, is the integrity of the information. Defective software could very easily start producing improper output. That output might be things we make management decisions or business decisions on, and certainly not at all a good place to be when you're making the wrong kinds of decisions. I think of commercials I saw where somebody, and this is more of an input error, but just imagine the program did this. They wanted to order 5 units of something and ended up getting 5,000 units of something. And of course, that's where they were talking about they have this big sale, right? Decisions like that can be very disastrous if it was from defective software. It could be bad configurations as well. That's always the issue. One of the things we tell people is that you should never have the default configuration on any network device. I remember I was with a friend. We were in Huntsville, Alabama, at a restaurant that advertised free Wi-Fi. And so we were at this restaurant, and we opened up our laptops, and we were trying to figure out which Wi-Fi access point it was. The only one we saw said Linksys. Now, if you're at all familiar with these small home user devices, Linksys is a company that makes access points for home users that makes some very good ones. But by default, it has a SSID of Linksys. Okay, so when I saw that, actually when we both saw that, because we're both in this kind of the security business, we immediately wondered to ourselves, do you think that they just accepted the default configuration? Because if they did, that means that we could connect to that access point with the username of admin, the password of admin, all published as the default configurations, and then once there, we could do almost anything we wanted to that access point. All right, what I can tell you is I didn't do that, but somebody did, and I witnessed the fact that it was on its default configurations. Potentially a very bad situation to be because, again, of the danger. It could also just be bad design. Now, bad design, again, can come in a lot of different options and flavors. If I'm thinking about a network, and, let me talk about cellular companies. I've done a lot of work for a lot of the major cellular companies. And I'll tell you that one of the things they put at the high rate of what's most important to them is that the network communications is always up. If there's an outage, it becomes an instantaneous emergency, and everybody works on it. Now, that outage could have come from a bad network design where they may have had a single point of failure, where losing one router, one switch, one port may have cut off an entire set of communication paths. That would be part of a bad design. It might just simply have a vulnerability of not having enough people to cover what you need. It could be an issue of poor passwords or a lack of redundancy. Kind of goes back to that single point of failure idea. As far as, if one port goes down, the traffic couldn't reroute around a different direction. which would be bad if you're in the middle of a phone call or needed to make a phone call. So all of these could be examples, as I said, about what a vulnerability might be. Now, when we take a look at risks, it's important to remember that we can't eliminate all of the risks, but instead our goal is to reduce the risk to a point of acceptance. Now, there are a lot of different categorizations of risk, things that you may consider, like facilities risk. I think we've talked a lot about physical facilities or risks of damage or theft. Health and safety. Now, we are, of course, talking about the people, but what exactly are we talking about? Since we're talking about information risk, a lot of you may say, well, where's the health and safety come in? You can consider the fact that employee records and the information about the people is information we want to keep safe. Losing that could affect their safety, could affect the health of their identity through identity theft, things like that. Information security, I think, again, we've covered a lot of ideas about those risks. Your control frameworks. Okay, again, your controls are your policies, your standards and procedures, and those things that we work with. And certainly there are some risks to having those incorrect. Risks to the reputation, technology risks, the risks of criminal acts. If we're dependent on suppliers, we have risks there as well. If I'm producing different types of widgets, but I need supplies, metal, steels, electrical items, and those don't come in, so I can't assemble those. Those are issues that we have to deal with. And of course, as we look at the worldwide distribution of our goods, perhaps there are some other geopolitical types of issues we have to deal with as far as the types of risks we may encounter. One of the things we look at is the analysis of the relevant risks. Now, risk analysis is the phase where the level of risk is assessed and it's understood. Now, this is the information that is first input into the decision that we're going to use to determine which risks need to be treated, as well as finding the most appropriate and cost-effective methodology. Now, this should include really a thorough examination of the risk sources. How did we learn about this information of what the risks are? We have to realize that there are going to be some positive and negative consequences. Now, I like that. Again, that gets me back into the politician mode where, it's hard to support, for any stance I take, there's a good side and a bad side. It very well may be that I might have some positive results of managing my risks in reducing that risk. But it may have some negative consequences in changing the way in which we do business or the way in which users can interact with systems. Maybe there are more hurdles they have to go through authentication. And, again, we can look at it from a positive, negative. But we're hoping for a net positive over any of the negative consequences. In other words, if it's a little more burdensome to use a system for a user, but we have a positive indication of not losing information that could cripple our organization, that's probably a good trade-off. Now remember, we also are interested in the likelihood that these risks may occur, and we also have to have an assessment of what existing controls do we have. Basically, back to our resources, what do we already have in place, and how are they working, or how can we tune them or configure them to help us get us to that new desired set of security that we're trying to achieve. With risk analysis, there are a couple of ways that we can approach it. As we've talked about, the qualitative analysis, which is a lot of, I like to say guesswork, but it's using expert opinions and advice to be able to help take a look at how well we think a risk may occur, what impact it potentially can have, and even in the looking at controls that we might use to mitigate those risks. The quantitative approach put hard numbers in there, but sometimes those numbers are hard to come by, and often we have to utilize a range of numbers. Some people even take a look at the quantitative and say, it's often best if we use the worst case scenario as the kind of numbers that we're talking about. And a semi-quantitative risk is trying to put together the qualitative, the opinions, with the quantitative analysis. And often you might see a rating chart that kind of breaks the two of those together as a way of doing the analysis. Now, there are any number of methods that you can use to estimate risk. A lot of mathematical formulas you can use in a quantitative analysis, a lot of different methods to the qualitative analysis. And it's important that you understand that there are ways, a lot of methods, because when you look at a risk and you think about the consequences, there could actually be multiple consequences to any particular risk. We talk about the fact that you might lose customer information. And although that may set back the company's ability to process, we still have to worry about the fact that it could affect a reputation, affect future orders. And so there you can kind of see that rippling effect, what we call a cascading effect. And of course, that risk may, with multiple consequences, could affect some of the objectives or different objectives that we're trying to achieve. Now, there's other information that we want to look at that we can put into as a factor into the risk analysis. One thing we can do is learn from past experience to see what kind of effect or impact we had for certain types of loss of information or for risks having occurred. We can take a look at well-known, reliable practices, sometimes even best practices. We may seek out the information or the opinions of specialists or expert advice on certain subject matters that we're looking at. And there are a number of existing models and simulations that can help us in the estimation of the overall risk as we're, again, going through the analysis portion. Now, with a semi-quantitative analysis, what we're looking at is, again, that kind of a combination of quantitative and qualitative. So what we do is we start off, of course, with what are the business assets and what are the threats. We have those in either the quantitative or qualitative environments. But what we do is we start looking for ratings for each threat, basically saying what would be the business impact. Now, the ratings are going to be a combination of an opinion with a range of monetary impact. That's where we get the semi-quantitative. So, two examples of doing the risk analysis might be if we're looking at the likelihood that a risk could occur. And, if we have a number rating scale of 1 through 5 or 1 through 7, we assign values to the objective or qualitative parts of our ratings. If I give the likelihood a rating of 1, then I'm saying, maybe there's really no meaningful impact. If the likelihood of that is a 3, then maybe we're saying, that is a level that could have an impact on the organization's brand. And then maybe say, with an estimation of about a $1 million loss. And so there you can see that I don't have any completely hard numbers, but putting in kind of the range of numbers along with the, the best opinion that we have based on the likelihood of what it could do. And so that's kind of what we're looking at is, putting in this semi-quantitative is having those kinds of charts where we have a value rating scale and a corresponding potential quantitative impact to be able to help us with making the opinion about looking at the risks, the likelihood of it, and the impact, and putting it all together. Now, the quantitative analysis example, I've kind of went through it all for you, hopefully fairly well at the very beginning of this domain. And that was in computing things like the annual loss expectancy. Remember, that was a combination of the single loss expectancy. And that was a basic multiplication of our exposure factor times the value of the asset. So now remember, the exposure factor was, if this risk were to occur, if it happened, what would be the estimated damage? And we kind of put that into a percentage, and I used a building catching on fire as an example, saying that, according to best practices, to past experience, that our exposure factor is saying that we'd have a 50% loss of the facilities. And then we multiply that by the value of the facilities. And that gave us what we call the single loss expectancy. And then we also wondered, what is the rate of occurrence? Now, I made the rate of occurrence, hopefully, a little over-exaggerated. I said, occurs once every 10 years. I'm hoping that's not the case for most of your buildings because, again, I wouldn't occupy that one. But if we were to look at floods, again, exposure factor of floods times the value of the property, and we have lots of historical data, right? We talk about past experiences. We have areas on maps that talk about if you're in the 10-year floodplain or the 100-year floodplain. And that kind of gives me an idea of the expected rate of occurrence of what can go on. And it's something we have to look at. I mean, if you think about insurance companies, if you want to just plain old flood insurance for your house, and you built your house right on the bank of a river that, let's say on the bank of the Mississippi, that seems to have a rate of occurrence of like every few months of flooding, that's going to probably price your cost of insurance out of the ordinary, where you probably couldn't even afford it, or they might not even offer it because they realize that it's a zero sum for them. So it is an important aspect that we look at when it comes to the rate of occurrence. I only make fun of the Mississippi because I remember down in St. Louis parking in a parking lot for a casino, and when I got out of that casino, 1/3 of my car was underwater. The water had risen during the time that I was in there. So, it just hits me as this idea of, was that the best place to park if I were to do that same type of risk analysis for parking my car? Anyway, so you can do the mathematics on that. It was at least a rental. All right. The other part of quantitative was the value at risk. Remember, again, that is something we're looking at. It's based on our historical data and as well as the probability of loss. Now, with that information, remember the other aspect of that was later when we looked at controls that could have helped reduce that risk. At some point, our goal was to try to reduce that single loss expectancy that was annualized over time based on the rate of occurrence. And then we had to make the decision as to whether or not that cost of that control was sufficient for the savings that we were incurring. And altogether, that kind of puts in that quantitative analysis. And again, I realize coming up with hard numbers, sure, hard number for a server. I could say I've spent $50,000 in the hardware for maybe a cluster of servers, and it's running my web e-commerce site. And even though I could tell you that those servers cost me $50,000, it's hard to still say if the servers failed, how much business revenue did I lose from not being able to take sales or orders when that's like my only method of being able to earn income for that corporation. So, that's where it gets a little trickier again to fully do a quantitative analysis. That's why I said right at the very beginning that it can be a very complex situation and a very time-consuming. But it is an important aspect that we have those values so that we can really determine what the impact's going to be, especially as we're eventually getting to the point where we try to decide ways and methods to reduce or mitigate that risk. Part of this analysis is as well as the evaluation of risks. Now, at some point, there has to be a decision that's going to be made about which risks need treatment and what are their priorities. And that kind of goes back to the prioritization of the assets. Now, the decisions are usually going to be based on the level of risk, and those, again, are related to the impact to our business. That's back to that prioritization. The likelihood of that event, and is there even an aggregated impact as well. Those are going to help put us on the list of which ones should we address. Especially if I have limited resource or limited funds, we want to make sure we're investing it in a place that would have the most impact or would be the way of reducing the most loss to our organization. Now, when we talk about the risk treatment, there are usually 4 strategic choices for how we deal with risk, the treatment of risk. One, of course, is that we might just decide, let's just terminate whatever that activity is that's giving rise to the risk. Now, if I were to say, and this, I would be probably the most unpopular security manager in my corporation if I said this, but I might say, there's too much malware out there. There's too many opportunities for people to download junk and be able to infect their systems and cause, a cascading effect of damage from the inside of my network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to terminate any external internet use. You can't go to the internet while you're at work. All right, that is an example. I could terminate that activity. Doing that, though, might not follow the business strategy because there may be legitimate needs for people to get out to the internet, whether for marketing, for customer evaluations, those types of things. I know I worked with a nuclear facility that had that same idea, that the idea of things we could download could be detrimental through email attachments to the internet. And they did. They said, the easiest way to deal with that risk is to terminate that activity. So they terminated any external access. Now, they were still able to receive email, and as far as I understood the process, I didn't witness it, but as I understood the process, they used what I like to call an air bridge, meaning there was no physical connection to the outside. They had an outside-facing email server. You could send messages to this person's address. They would be scanned, looked at, read, analyzed to make sure there was no malware, copied to some other media, and manually transferred to an internal email server that could then deliver the message inside after it was determined to be safe. Likewise, all outgoing email went through the same process as well. So, that was a way. Now, Again, I don't know what the cost benefit was, but considering it was a nuclear facility, I'm thinking there was probably the likelihood of a very large impact if there was a problem over there. Another option, of course, is transference of risk to another party. I use insurance companies as that example because when I take out an insurance policy, I'm basically saying I understand that there is a risk, and if that happens and there's an impact, then monetarily I'm hoping for the reimbursement from that insurance company so that I can repair whatever the problems were. Now, that doesn't mean I might not try to lower my risk to maybe get better rates, but that is a treatment that we have, or as an option that we can use for risk. And having just said that, lowering my risk potential to get a better rate on my transference or insurance policy means that I can actually combine some of these different risk treatment options together, which, as I just mentioned, one of them was mitigating the risk. Mitigating is, of course, the reduction, realizing we'll never get rid of it 100%, but trying to reduce, hopefully, the impact or the likelihood of it occurring. Now, we also could just tolerate the risk. That means we could just plain old say, I realize there's a risk, that whatever activity is going on has these potentials. I'm not going to invest anything into trying to reduce that. Maybe through mitigation, through a bit of awareness and security training could certainly help. But, that might be to the extent that we're going. We're just going to basically accept the risk as it is. Now, there are some risk assessment frameworks that we can use as a tool. It can be used in helping determine the treatment of risk depending on its severity. So now, having said that, here's kind of the idea of the framework. It kind of goes back into the roles and responsibilities as far as who can make the decisions about the types of treatment of risk. Now, if we look at the risk assessment and we see that we have a low level of risk, that's something that local management could choose to go ahead and accept or to tolerate. But if it's a risk level that's at a medium level, that's not something we should leave to the low management or local management to make those decisions. That is a decision about the treatment that we should see with the Chief Information Officer. If it's a high level of risk, it should be something that's approved by the Chief Information Officer or maybe the Chief Information Security Officer. And extremely severe levels should be something that's only approved by the Board of Directors or at that C-suite of levels, the CEOs and those types of folks that are at that executive management. Well, a lot of what we've talked about is the impact if we are actually there and find ourselves being exploited and having a loss. The impact is the bottom line for risk management, as it is the result of the vulnerability, as I said, that was exploited. Now, often the impact is modified as a financial loss in the short term, but there are some other corresponding things that we have to worry about for the indirect financial loss in the long term. And again, it could be the loss of money. Well, what does that mean? As I said, it could have a loss of reputation, of brand, of customers trusting us. We could lose business contacts or business associations that may never come back. And that's something that we really have to consider. I saw one aspect of a series of how much an impact can affect like a small business. And I saw some indications that said that if a small business were, through a loss or impact, unable to complete or do the job that organization's done, the business objectives, for an average of a week, if 7 days they were just out of business, that often they were never able to recover that money, and many of them ended up eventually out of business altogether. So an impact is something we certainly have to study because it can have a long-term effect. Certainly going out of business is pretty long-term. We also have to remember that there can be criminal or civil liability as well. Especially you should be worried if you are in the executive management board of directors because often you are held for the criminal or civil liabilities. Now, I used the example of Enron that was going out and doing something to manipulate their books to make it, I guess, look like they were more profitable than they were, where it looks like they were actually losing money. That certainly affected shareholders of the company who suddenly one day woke up, found out that they owned nothing. It certainly affected employees who may have been vested with their retirement into that corporation. I remember another company that's local to where I lived. I won't talk about the name, even though it's out of business. Well, it's in business, but has changed hands many times. but they were an engineering facility, one of the largest, if not the largest in the world. And I remember that when they basically made some bad financial decisions and went out of business, that those people that were working there for 30 years and expecting to retire on their stocks that they had in that company suddenly found out they can't retire. They had no funds to do that. Do you think there's a civil liability potential? Well, maybe not so much in a bankruptcy, but certainly if it's a loss that we could have avoided through better risk management. And of course, criminal charges can come out of that as well. So all of those are issues we have to look at when we are deciding about what impact it is and just how serious that impact could be. Let's take a look at our controls, countermeasures. Now remember, controls were the things we described as policies, procedures, practices, and guidelines that we use to help provide assurance that our business objectives are going to be achieved. The countermeasure, although we can think of it as a control, we often thought of it as a targeted control, and is specifically used to help reduce the threat or the vulnerability that we might be seeing. Now let's take a look at controls. There are a couple of different ways we can view these and talk about them. The first, of course, would be the control design considerations. Now, in the considerations, that might be things that include the measurability and the effectiveness. Now, I know I've made a statement about this before, but when we think about a control, there are often many solutions that can be just as effective as the others. Some may differ in their effectiveness slightly, their throughputs, some of the extra capabilities or features we might have thought as a bonus. But, measurability is another factor. Measurability is my ability to watch it, to monitor it, to get metric information that lets me know if it's really doing its job, so that I can have an ongoing management or maintenance of that control. Now, if the control has a very complex mechanism for me to be able to get meaningful information from it, as far as the measurability, then it may not even be worth trying to use that control, because we could say in a way that it's not as effective. Now, effectiveness might be, of course, the reduction of the risk, but it also needs to be effective for me to actually know that it's working and that I can prove that it's in compliance with whatever our policies or procedures or standards are going to be. Now, the control strength is another aspect that we look at it. And a lot of those decisions about the strength of a control do depend on the type of control that it is. We have, again, preventive controls, which may be trying to prevent an activity. That could be some sort of device that might be screening the content of web pages you visit, or firewalls preventing attacks or different types of unwanted traffic from coming in. We may also have detective types of controls. Detective types of controls may again be intrusion detection systems, or if I move into the physical realm, it could be a motion detector alarm or a closed circuit TV, or camera, I guess you could say, but it was still part of closed circuit TV. And again, when we're measuring strength, we can ask questions again of a firewall. What's its throughput? How does it survive if it's under stress? So all of those are important aspects to us. Same with cameras. If I need one that can do a pan, tilt, and zoom, one that works at low level at nights, those types of things. Some controls may be manual, some may be automated. And by the way, we often think of an automated control as being much stronger than a manual control. Often we say that because an automated control, through the use of automation, does not as easily allow people to manually intervene or to get around that particular control. A manual control very easily could just be simply a magnetic key lock at the front entrance of a door. It doesn't automatically work. I have to swipe my card by it. The problem is I can hold that door open and let as many people in as I want to, because it is manually available for me to circumvent. So those are some of the things we may consider as we are looking at the strength of a control. The control methods, again, we need to evaluate it. Is it a technical type of control or a non-technical type of control? Many of our non-technical type of controls, again, could go back into the realm of the policies and standards. They certainly could be the use of guards, of motion detection equipment, as I mentioned before. Technically, putting a fence around your compound is a type of control. You're trying to control the way in which traffic comes in. Putting razor wire on top of it is trying to help really ensure that you're controlling the point of entry. A technical control could simply be something we use for authentication methods. Again, that's could also be part of the detective aspect. needing the fingerprint reader or the retina scan. We also know that from what I've just talked about, that controls come in different categories. Those categories are the ways in which we determine what the control is designed to do. I've mentioned preventive and detective. We also have some that can be corrective or compensatory or even deterrent. The fence with the razor wire is a good example of a deterrent type of control, trying to deter you from going over the fence but around and through the main entrance. So again, we look at these controls by these categories, and based on all this information, hopefully we can make control recommendations so we can say that, based on what we've looked at through the way we've categorized and typed the controls, that we can document those features and make recommendations as to what might be the best control that we're looking for in the mitigation of our risk. Remember now, we can't get rid of all risk. No control is 100% effective, so there always is risk, and that risk left over is called the residual risk. Now, how do we know what the residual risk is going to be? Well, we're going to find out about that the same way we found out what the original risk was. The original risk we found through the use of risk assessments. Now, after a control is in place, nobody said you're done with risk assessments. There should be subsequent risk assessments so that we can now take a look and see what we have effectively reduced the risk to. Hopefully, I should say, have reduced the risk to, so that we can find out what is left over. And remember, we can use this risk assessment to kind of alter our roadmap. If we found out that we're not at that desired state that we want to be in, it may tell us that either we have the wrong control, maybe the wrong configurations, or we need to continue to work towards getting ourselves down to that risk that the company or organization was willing to accept. Now, in that aspect, the controls we get should be considered through their costs and benefits. In other words, one of the things we have to ask is the cost of that control going to even exceed the benefits that are being achieved? Now, I could use an example here of a large vendor, a Cisco, Juniper, Palo Alto firewall. And let's just say that I have a branch office that's supporting maybe 50 workers there. And I'm looking at a control like a firewall as a preventive type of control. And I need one that can at least handle those 100 users that are going through, with however many sessions of communications they have. And and maybe I'm connected to a small WAN connection that gives me only so much bandwidth. So the question is can I get away with buying one of those $1 million firewalls, those services gateways as they call them, and use that for my 100 people? I mean, certainly it would probably give them more than enough throughput, even though it's probably far exceeds what they can get on their service provider. And it can certainly handle, some of them, 500,000 new sessions per second, which might certainly be sufficient for the 100 people that are in that office. But, is that investment of $1 million some odd dollars kind of in excess of the benefits that I'm going to achieve? Or could I have done better with cost-wise with a much smaller unit that can still meet those needs, but might come in at a few $100s instead of getting to that 6 or 7 digit number price tag? And now I realize what I gave you was an extreme scenario, but it is something you should think about. I, in fact, have seen the opposite of that happen. I saw the opposite of it happen for one of these online universities that had many little classrooms all around the place. And they found an effective control of a firewall, but they actually got one that was incapable of handling the number of sessions that they needed, which meant that they put a lot of expenditure in, put in a control that was effective in reducing the risk. It did control the traffic as needed. It provided the throughput that it needed, but it was insufficient to be able to work for the number of people at each of these offices. In essence, they kind of throttled themselves or did their own denial of service. So, I think when we talk about cost, I gave you one extreme of spending way too much money. There is the other extreme of not putting in enough for the proper type of equipment or control that you need. Let's take a look at the information resource valuation. Now, some assets can be quantitatively valued, while others it might not be so easy to determine the type of value it has. Now, that's just a plain old statement. As we said, there can be a lot of factors that get involved as to why we may or may not be able to quantitatively value some sort of information. Now, some of those things that we might not be able to find as much or easy value to Could be things like proprietary information, the way in which your company does business, who your customers are, and those types of things. Trade secrets, obviously, patent information. We see a lot of people a lot of companies in a way do lawsuits over infringement of patents, and it's really hard to be able to really say what was that loss. Often they have to make estimations about how much a company profited over the violation of their patent. Personnel identification, again, we start losing that information, whether internal employees or customers. We don't know really what the long-term effect of that's going to be. Copyright information, we see that all the time today in the music industry as they're trying to find ways to reduce the loss of their copyrighted information. People downloading their movies and their music without having to pay the royalties and the fees. Really hard for them to do an estimation. And that's the same within your organization as well, as information that you're the owner of that you don't want to lose. Now, as we look at methods of valuing assets, there are some approaches, and the approach of doing the valuation is used to basically determine a monetary value. And of course, that might be something that's easy to do with things like artwork. But another approach is to look at the value add, or some of the intangible cascading effects that the information may have. And again, remember, a cascading effect just simply means that the loss of some information, or even the alteration or damage of that information, can ripple out and cause other bad decisions and other information to no longer be valid either. Now, in many cases, the accuracy of the valuation is sometimes not as critical as maybe the approach we use to help prioritize the efforts that we use to lessen the risk. Now, what does that mean to us? It means that, okay, look, maybe I can't put an actual value on the asset, but that doesn't mean I can't still find the criticality of what it would mean to us if we lost that information, what the impact is going to be. And so even without a value that we have, we know the criticality, and that still helps put that information at a higher priority, that we would use our efforts there on this high priority information to help lessen the risk. Now, the process, again, for doing valuation can be very time consuming and potentially very complex, as I've tried to mention over and over again with some examples of just what does it mean in the long term. And sometimes the valuation of the assets may just have to be judgmental or done in a qualitative manner. Now, beyond the evaluation, as we said, which can be very difficult to do, it doesn't mean that we couldn't figure out the criticality, the classification. So when we talk about the information asset classification, we are talking about its sensitivity and criticality that has to be some way reflected in the assets classification. Now, that might be things that we consider, such as, in doing this, is how many classification levels do I really need? Now, that is sometimes a difficult aspect because you can become too fine-tuned and make it very difficult. If I were to use a different real-world example of as far as risk when it comes to security, we have in the United States a color-coded system for the threat level that we're at, that we need to know about what we're supposed to do if we're going to an airport, boarding a plane, those types of things. And they use a color-coded system, and now that I think about it, I don't remember if it's a 3 or 4 color system. But we realize that some higher colors, a classification of red is pretty darn scary, right? It's like, hey, watch out! Things are going bad and could go bad very quickly. They want you to be more aware of your surroundings and what's happening. Okay, so that's an example of a classification level. You might call it an alert level. But we have to look at the same thing. Would it have been better served for public use if I had 20 different colors to remember? Probably at that point, no, because I doubt that I would remember what each of those color codings meant. Having 3 or 4 was an easier system, at least for me to help understand the classification. Now, what you use in your company, again, is up to what makes sense. But generally speaking, we try not to have too many classifications. Now, the next thing we have to do is, how do we determine what are the assets? Again, is that back to hardware as the assets? Is it the information that's stored on that hardware? What is it that we're looking for as far as what the assets are? And then from that point, we have to decide, well, all right, now how are we going to mark these assets? How should they be handled or even transported? And again, transportation could be of a physical device. It could be the transformation or transportation of data across a network connection. We also realize that over time, information is no longer as valuable as it once was. So that at some point we have to realize there is a life cycle of the asset. Then we also have to remember that there are some regulatory compliances that we have to consider. You know, if we're in a medical industry, HIPAA has a very lengthy set of regulations that talk about patient privacy and the steps we need to go through to ensure the privacy of their information. And so, you know, that right there is something we have to realize. That is what we have to look at as far as the classification system of that information. And so again, right, we have to realize that some of those regulations may make some information higher in the list of classifications than it might actually be to my particular business. And finally, we have to determine the ownership of data or the asset, and also determine what are the access rights that we give to people in being able to utilize that particular asset. So all of these can come down into helping you, as you answer those questions, in helping you come up with a proper classification system for those assets. Now, having a classification system and some things we can answer, the next thing we have to do is actually determine the classification. Well, one of the first things you should do is look at the impact to the organization of the lost asset. And that should be considered rather than maybe by the means in which the damage can be done. Okay, so what are we saying here? We're not looking at the vulnerability of the asset. We're not looking at the ways in which it can be attacked. We're actually just saying, if it's lost, what is the impact going to be? That may be a significant help in determining the classification. Now, the rating systems you use, as I said, should be approved by senior management. There shouldn't be a lot of them. Sometimes part of the classification may be also to consider the cascading effect. And that means that in the classification, it might not be possible to classify everything, maybe because of constraints of time. And so one of the other things you might use is, as an effective option for determining classification is just that dependency assessment. Again, the cascading effect. So those are all going to be helpful in getting to the proper classification. Now, what are your steps for the classification? Well, of course, the first thing, as I said, is finding, locating, and identifying what the information resources are. Then, of course, determining the ownership of the data, and as well as who its users are. We may even have to determine if there are any third parties involved, maybe in the storage or the transportation of that information. And again, putting it into the classification, the higher the classification, the more we're going to expend time cycles at determining ways to protect it. But whenever you're going through this process, to avoid confusion, make the classification as simple as you can so that it's not going to have so much variety that people may spend time arguing over, is it a classification 5,000 or 6,000? Okay, I'm getting a little extreme there with all of the different classification numbers. Now, your impact assessments is a way of being able to add value to an asset. Because what you can do is, through the impact assessment, is you can determine things like replacement cost. Now, replacement cost of hardware, I think, is pretty straightforward. I know what a new server costs, and I can figure out how much time it takes to set up that server and to restore information to it. But of course, replacement cost for data, now that's a different story. Now, I don't know if I made mention about an issue I found at a plant that I was working at in the Portland, Oregon area. Again, I know I'm being vague because a lot of times with non-disclosures, I can't talk about specifics. Now, I was there for a different purpose than what I'm about to talk about. But while I was there, they had a little problem with one of their SQL servers. And to tell you how long ago this was, it was a SQL Server 6.5. That means it was prior to the year 2000. Now, what had happened was that they had a loss of hardware, the hard drive. And so they needed to rebuild their SQL Server, and they were trying to restore the information from their backups. Now, they had never gone through the process of actually testing the backups to make sure that they actually were working. And if I remember right, it took them to go back almost 8 months in time before they found a backup that they could use for a restoration. All right, so what's the replacement cost of that information? 8 months of information that dealt with customers, their orders, their inventory. Yes, they had those paper records. I mean, that's how the data originally got in. It was not near the type of automation we have today with a nice front-end point of sale type of setup. That's a lot of people spending a lot of time recreating information. So, you think about it, when you're doing your impact assessment, that's a part of the replacement cost as well, especially if it's data or information. What would it take to recreate that? We also want to consider the impact if we have a loss of integrity, of availability, or confidentiality. Again, integrity just means information's been changed. If I don't know how it's been changed, then I have a tough time being able to come back to the original information I was supposed to have. Availability can be what we call high availability now, eliminating single points of failure. To have multiple servers acting in a cluster, so if one goes down, the other can still work, or a network load balancer to do essentially the same type of idea. Using storage area networks so that this data is always available, regardless of what server that we're using. And of course, the confidentiality is what would happen if the information was stolen. Could it be stolen? Do we have an encryption, both in storage and in motion? All right, all of those are things we can look at as the impact. You might consider looking at different scenarios that have a range of potential outcomes. Now, through the scenario base and having a range of outcomes is kind of helpful because, as I said, especially in like a quantitative type of a method, sometimes we want to have a worst case scenario, but have a range from which we can work at. We also want to know what would be the adverse impact of a successful threat to the asset. All right, so all of these are part of your impact assessments. Now, one of the things you can use is a business impact analysis or a business impact assessment, a BIA, to help identify the impact of risks. And that information from the result of that assessment can help you in determining some of the classifications that you might use when you're dealing with your data. And that information can also be a part of the impact assessment as well. So, again, remember, you're trying to determine the impact that a loss might have. And it's, again, we're not necessarily looking at the risk that the loss might occur, but we're on just pure impact assessment, we're saying, if it happened, here's the scenario, here's what it could mean to our corporation. Now, an effective approach for your impact assessment might be to use a small set of scenarios as ways to analyze what could happen. And that way, again, you get a range of outcomes that can be determined from that. Now, this approach can often provide maybe a more realistic look at the actual impact that a loss might have. Now, before you start an impact assessment, some of the questions you might want to have answered are things like, what is the system's mission? In other words, what does the process do? What is the system and data criticality? And also we might ask questions like, what is the system, data, and personnel criticality? Questions like, what's the impact if we have an unintended disclosure of information? Again, if we talk about health records for patients, what's that impact going to be if the wrong people get to see that information when we know that we're supposed to keep it as private as we can, especially through regulations like HIPAA? Some of the other things we should consider are things like the recovery time objectives. Now, we also have recovery point objectives as well. Now, the goal for recovery time is really to determine what is an acceptable time to be able to return to normal operations. Now, this will vary, of course, depending on the criticality of the assets, and that is something we have to think about because, again, we may have classifications of things that are critical, meaning we need to have it returned within minutes versus those things that may be okay to go for several days or even weeks. Now, the RTO should be considered as far as the time of the occurrence as well. Sometimes it may not be as critical in off hours if I'm not a 24-hour type of a business. The business continuity plan should reflect what your recovery time objectives are. Now, when we talk about recovery point objectives, one of the things we might take a look at is, how quick of a recovery do we need? And sometimes that recovery may be really based on the frequency of how backups are performed. So our goal might be to lose as little data as possible, but it has to be balanced with the availability of the asset during the backup. So what does that mean? That means sometimes we have to also consider the time that it takes to recover as far as the backup process. So let's just take an example of a server that has data on it. generally speaking, we conduct a full backup at one point, and one of the downsides of a full backup is that the information might be readable, but we can't have any updates or modifications to the data during the time that it takes to do that full backup. And a full backup for a large amount of data may take a lot of time. Now, if I decided that I wanted to do that on every single day of the week, then what we're coming to is, what does it take to do the recovery? Well, one of the cool things is that if I'm doing a full backup every single day of the week, then if this is the point at which something fails, I can simply recover the information from having one backup to restore. Now, there is a balance there as well as far as the availability, right? It says we want to balance it with availability. Well, the problem is if it takes 4 or 5 hours every day to do that backup, then that's leaving the data in somewhat of an unavailable state. So another thing we could look at here, as I get rid of my little backup drawings, is that we may choose to do things like a differential or incremental backup. These are just making changes or copies of what has changed since the last full backup. The purpose of this is that in doing these, in this case I'm doing little incremental ones, so I'll put an I up above them, that I'm just backing up what has changed since the last backup. So this first incremental is changing, keeping a copy of what's changed since the full, and this one's doing it since that last incremental and that last incremental. And again, if now is where I lose my service here, then my restoration may take a little bit more time because I will have to restore that full backup and then restore each of the incrementals in the order in which they were taken. So that may increase my recovery time, although giving me better availability. That also might not be a solution. So other options we have in this process is doing what we call a differential. Now, the difference in a differential and an incremental is that the differential is still backing up those things that have changed since the last full backup, but each day it doesn't mark it as being backed up, so when I do the next differential, it still has to back up everything from the last full backup. That means that we are doing a duplicate of the work we did on this differential. Okay, now the benefit there, eventually you'll see that, but one of the downsides of that is that the differential may take slowly every day a little bit more time to do because the amount of files changing since those previous backups might be increasing. So again, as I'm going on through time, the availability becomes less. But if now I have that failure, as you saw there before, I have to first restore the full, and then I can restore my last differential, so my recovery is faster. Now, the availability is still greater because it doesn't take as long to do the differential as it did to do the full backup. But it's, again, it's a balancing act. Now, of course, that's where Windows came in with this idea of the shadow volume copy so that we can do some of these backups and still maintain availability for the use of the files. And things like that are nice innovations that are really kind of working towards understanding about recovery point objectives and balancing it with our availability. The other thing we look for are the service delivery objectives. Now, your SDOs are defined as the minimal level of service that must be restored after an event to be able to meet certain business requirements. All right, so sometimes these are articulated within our service level agreements. Now, I made a mention of working with cellular phone companies, and for them, any single minute of outage is a severe impact in what they have to maintain for their customers. And so they design their networks purposely to avoid single points of failure, so that cellular traffic will still move, the business connectivity will still work, but sometimes we have to say, okay, let's take a look at it. We realize in today's world that sometimes voice and data travel a little bit differently, cellular connections, and we talk about this 4G service and the 3G service and CDMAs, and I'm trying to make sure I'm not being any vendor specific. GSM. All right, so what we're saying though is that maybe if I lose connectivity, what is the minimum level of service? Maybe I have to guarantee that phone voice services are the first thing restored, or consider that the minimal level of service. That way, if there's an emergency, you can call for emergency services. You just might not be able to look up what coffee shop is closest to you. So, again, these are just examples I'm throwing out there as what might be considered minimum service levels until normal operations can resume. Now, your SDOs are going to be affected by the RTOs and the RPOs, as we talked about before, the restore time and the restore points. And your SDOs, again, the service delivery objects or objectives, should still be a consideration that you have when you're working with your risk management strategy. Realizing that if you want a higher level of service as your minimum service, it may require more resources to be able to provide it. We also want to consider third-party service providers. I mean, we realize there are going to be times when your organization must outsource. So there are some things we should consider for using third parties, and those are things like, does the third party have appropriate controls in place? Is there an appropriate risk management clause in the agreement? Does the third party perform their own risk assessments? What is the proper level of due diligence that I require from that third party? And what is the complexity of the management that can be incurred by using a third party? So, when you think about these things as a whole, we really realize that we're under a contract with them, but we don't manage that organization, not unless they allow us in there. And so we have to look to see if they are using the same diligence that we do for determining their risks, doing their own risk assessments, having their own security strategy, and hoping that it's still in alignment with our business objectives. That's something else we have to make sure, is that the use of the third party is helping support the business. So a lot of times there may be very complex contracts to get these agreements. And I have seen times when, as I mentioned before, when companies want to do credit card processing, that if they want to directly interface with the bank for credit card processing, the bank literally may send an assessment team out there to do their own risk assessment of that corporation to determine whether or not they meet that same level of basic safety and security that they want to be able to interact with them. In other words, by bringing a third party into the bank, you are incurring a new potential of risk. So here are some considerations you should look at when you're outsourcing. Number one, there is an increase in your information risk. Other people are working with your information, and they very well could lose that information outside of your control. I realize that sometimes when a company like Microsoft that is guarding the secrets of their source code, and some of it has been released, often it is found that it was released because they were working with a third party to develop maybe an application or to tweak a service, working with Windows, with Microsoft, and they have control of that source code. And if they aren't as secure, then losing that information is just as bad as if Microsoft lost it themselves. So there is that increase in that information risk. We have to realize there is a separation of responsibilities. It may mean that it's harder for us to manage. There's also a separation of control responsibilities. If your control is your policies and procedures, that's not necessarily their policies and procedures. If the control is something more targeted, like a firewall protecting traffic into your company, that's not the same firewall used to protect the traffic going into that third party's organization. So we have that separation. We also have to look to see, does that third party fall under the same regulatory enforcements that we might be under? And if not, do we need to make sure that they are adhering to those because they are a contractor with our organization? So again, it's adding complexity, all right? Making it more complex to assess the actual business function, more complex to do the assessment of the outsourcing provider itself, and of course the fact that there is a new assessment you have to do from outsourcing. So now it almost sounds like I said the same thing twice, but I just want to clarify it. One is we're assessing the provider of the outsource, and the fact that we're using outsourcing adds in that extra bit of assessment that we have to look at. So a little separation there as far as what I'm trying to convey when we say there's some added complexity. Let's take a look at working with the lifecycle processes. One of the important tasks of security management is to be able to integrate the risk assessment into the lifecycle process of the asset. That means, of course, that we wanted to look at risk and security from the very inception of that asset all the way to its end of life. Now, this might include having to deal with change management as well. Because remember, assets is not just information. It can be hardware, it can be software. And so as we do upgrades or change the type of information we're storing or do hardware changes, that might change the actual risk that we see. So we want to include the risk, the change management in this process. Now, the impact of change management should address your security policies as well as considerations of new risks. Now, this is not necessarily the place where we talk about ITIL and get into a lot of the actual management of information systems, because our focus is on security. But I can say that in the process of change management, there's more to it than just simply submitting this is what I'm going to do and somebody say, yeah, that sounds good, and checking it off. At least it should be a little more complicated. It should actually look at the existing security policies, look at your standards and procedures as far as how to make the changes, and make the determination if the change is at least still in the same type of integration or in line with your policies, and that you're not going outside of your standards. And if you follow that process, then hopefully our goal is that we are still lessening the amount of risk that we might incur by making changes. Now, the change of your asset is a part of the regular life cycle. That's part of the managing and maintaining it, and so it's important that we consider this through the entire life cycle process. Now, in the software development life cycle, as we talk about SDLC, we can see an example of the life cycle process. We have the original initiation of this project itself, phase 1. And throughout that process, as a part of phase 1, we should be thinking about the underlying risks, that we should be understanding the type of data that we're going to be storing or the information we're going to be working with, what the user interface looks like, who should have access to it. All of these are a part of the initiation, as well, of course, as developing the underlying structure for what it is you're going to develop. And then, of course, phase 2 is the development or the acquisition. Now, during the development process, again, we may have milestones that we reach that we can still run assessments to see where we are, to see what has come about as far as the development process for the changing of risks or the reassessment of risks. At some point when it's done with the development process, we move into the implementation. Through the implementation, again, we have to worry about the deployment, right, as far as how we actually get to this asset out into the wild, if you would like to say it that way. That's of an issue, right? We have to worry about the implementation, about people trying to circumvent security, understanding the secure communications process we might need to be able to push the information out. Once it's implemented, we have the regular operation and the maintenance of this asset, of whatever it is, again, that we're using. And that, again, means that could be the change, where we talked about change management. We want to check the validity of the information going in, the validity of information going out. That might be a part of the overall assessment. Again, just throwing out examples of what we have to look at. And, of course, at some point when we go to the end of life and we go to the disposal of that asset, if we were to talk about hard drives as an example, we need to make sure we have an appropriate set of steps or procedures in place to do that correctly so that we aren't inadvertently giving away information, causing our own loss of information by the way in which we dispose of the assets when we're finished with them. When we take a look at project management, we look and see that risk management is a part of the overall project management. Maybe not in the same systematic manner, but it is a part of the project. The life cycle approach should be considered for use in project management to help better support risk assessment. Because again, as you look at that project from that entire life cycle, we ought to be looking at risk assessment all the way along that life cycle span. Now, if you have periodic reporting of the project, that kind of helps reflect the idea or the concept of what's called the Earned Value Management, or EVM. So it is actually maybe a benefit to say that we want to be able to provide risk assessment, work with risk management throughout the life cycle of a project to get a better earned value of management. Part of your project management might be to define baselines. Now, a baseline technically is just a line that serves as a basis or foundation for a known measure or position. That's about as vague as we can get on the baseline. Now, to the evolving nature of IT hardware and software, you should have a regular valuation of what your baseline is. Now, if you're thinking about that as far as hardware, you may have ideas of what the minimum requirements are for a server's hardware, how many processors it has, how much memory it has, storage capability, that you never want to go below that baseline. For software solutions, you may have the same thing. When we're talking about security, we have what we might call the minimum basis of security. We call that our baseline. Again, it's a position or a point or a measure of where we want to be at worst case scenario. That's at least how I look at the baseline. It's my starting point. That means that over time, as we do increase hardware, as we do increase software, as we introduce new assets and potentially new sets of risks, that means that there should be an ongoing assessment of the risk and the evaluation of that, so that we know our baseline, if it's still good where it is or if it needs to be changed. It's common to rate a security baseline as the minimum amount of security that you need to have, as I've said before, and maybe even a minimum amount of security as employed throughout an organization. Another example of a baseline might be where we have a password policy that says you need to have at least 8 characters in length of a password. It must be complex and must be changed every 30 days. Over time, you might realize that new techniques of attacks might make it very easy to crack an 8-character password, and so now you have to change the baseline appropriately as your new minimums and say now your passwords have to be 10 characters long. That doesn't prohibit a user from making a 20 or 30 character password, but we are providing, again, that what I call that minimum, a baseline of what we need to have for that particular security issue.